Okay, so we've been talking about the code of ethics all along with our safety scenarios, but now we're going to go over the actual codes. Tonight, we're not going to go over all 6 sections, but we are going to go over the highlighted ones. All of section 1 is our responsibility to our clients, and that is the #1 section that you want to read. So although I do want you to read it cover to cover, I also want you to, after you read it cover to cover, specifically focus on section 1 so that you have a good working knowledge of what it says. You don't have to know A says this, B says this, C says this. So when we go over the codes, I'm going to show you the letters that are really important, okay? It's all important, but these are the topics that continue to show up on the exam, and that should be a foundation of your studying. And then the other things could also be on your exam as well, and these are some highlighted ones. In particular, misrepresentation is one of those areas that is not something we talk about a lot, but also can show up on the exam. So I have linked the Code of Ethics here and the 2021 amendments. 2021, they focus a little bit more on cultural competency and also self-care. So also making sure you know what the signs of burnout are. And I will make sure to also include that additional information. Okay, our favorite, countertransference and transference. Let me go back one. Can you tell me which one, countertransference or transference, is us that has the feelings? So typically it's feelings that are adverse. Counter, yes. So counter is us, the worker, and transference is the client. So the client may have some type of emotional reaction to you. It could be that they have a sexual attraction to you, or it could be that you remind them of someone. All of that is transference. Countertransference is us. And for us, it could just honestly be we're an annoyance, right? Sometimes if our clients are annoying to us, we can tolerate it better than others. If it's starting to impact our work, right? I'm supposed to meet with them for an hour, but I meet with them for 40 minutes because they got on my nerves. Definitely countertransference. We all have a bad day, but we don't want our countertransference to impact our therapeutic relationship that we have with our clients, right? And so we want to make sure that we are checking our feelings, okay? Especially sexual feelings. And if you pay attention to your state board's newsletter, or they might put it on their website, it's very common for social workers to have sexual relationships with their clients. In our profession, we're unique in that once a client, always a client. I don't care if you were in high school 25 years ago and you haven't talked to them since high school, that is a dual relationship, okay? So we're a little bit different. The medical field, once the surgery is over, it's fair game, right? But for social work, because I guess of the social nature of our work, it's a little bit different. The remedy to both is to process in supervision. So if your client is showing some emotions towards you, you may need to process it before you address it or discuss it. If you're having feelings, you want to address it in supervision. That's typically the first line of defense. And then if the feelings, especially for the social worker, cannot be resolved, then you may want to transfer the client if necessary. Again, transferring the client is typically a last resort, but you don't want to harm the client either. So as we talk about ethical dilemmas, this is talking about ethical dilemmas and how we resolve it. So we want to determine if it's an actual dilemma, because sometimes what we think is ethical is really a preference, right? We may be so upset that at our agency, they do not do blank, right? But is that really against the code of ethics, or is it just something that you don't like, right? And so if you just don't like it, then it's not an ethical dilemma. It has to have some type of conflict with a value, right, or responsibility of the code of ethics. Also, on the exam, the code of ethics is premier. It will trump any job or work policies. So if you suspect or have concerns about how your agency is operating, and it asks you what to do first, consult the work policies or consult the code of ethics, the answer is always consult the code of ethics. And in terms of a work policy versus the code of ethics, they would like you, they meaning the National Association of Social Work, would like you to, well, not really them, really the exam. The exam would like you to lose your job in order to uphold the code of ethics. So on the exam, you're going to lose your job, okay? It's serious. When in real life, we're going to do as we're told until we kind of get pushed too far, and then we'll be like, oh no, I got to quit, right? And we might say, well, I'm going to report my agency to the board, right? But we're going to also talk about how do we address unethical behavior as well. So step one, review the code of ethics and find out if there's an actual ethical issue. Step two, really look and see which ones are involved, right? Which key values or principles. Step three, rank them. Step four, develop a plan, implement your plan, and then reflect and evaluate. So here's an ethical dilemma example. A social worker is working with an older adult client who is showing signs of cognitive decline. Doesn't give an age, but the client insists on living independently, even though it is apparent that their safety is at risk. The social worker faces a conflict, and it kind of tells us what the conflict is, between client autonomy and intervening in the client's best interest. So when it says client autonomy, which principle is that really saying? What do we call client autonomy? Perfect. Self-determination, absolutely. And then when you click this, it just gives some more examples of what some conflicts could be, some ethical dilemmas could be. So let's take the example and let's use our problem-solving steps. So I kind of put step 1 and 2 together. And so we have self-determination and the best interest or safety of our client. Then we're going to rank them. I ranked safety is a little bit better, but this one could go either way depending on what information we gather. So I would say that we need to determine what is the exact safety concern. Because again, is it really a safety concern, or is it just, I don't like the fact that my client is home by themselves, or I don't like the fact that, you know, this happens, that happens. And so what also assess from what the doctor says, and it kind of inferred that the client may not have capacity anymore, so we may need to assess that as well. So the actual result of what will happen, of course, would determine on what kind of information we gather, because maybe we can see if this is really, if they're really at risk, especially if there has been an incident that has happened. And so maybe we just give some resources for them to stay at home, but maybe not fully independent. Maybe they need someone to come during the day. So things like that. And then we implement the plan and then reflect on whether it really worked out. So that's kind of the problem solving steps. All right, now we're going to go over the exact codes. Again, you don't need to know the numbers. You just need to know the letter of the law kind of thing. So commitment to clients. What is the best interest of our clients? And of course, we cannot uphold the best interest of the client if it is child abuse and neglect, right? So self-determination does not mean that I'm self-determined to abuse my child, right? That doesn't fall, right? That's going to fall under, we need to report it, threat of harm to self or others, right? That's kind of where that falls. Self-determination, again, doesn't mean that there are certain decisions of our clients that we know may not be the best decisions, right? But they're not safety decisions, right? They're not going to put themselves or others at in harm's way. And so that's where we do have to support them. But we can give a little, it's not persuading on the exam, but if we have a discussion, like let's discuss it. That sounds like persuading, but on the exam, it's not. It's just discussing, right? What are the benefits? What are the risks if you do this? Especially if you've been working with your client on achieving their goals and they've been doing really well. And then they are like, oh, but I decided to do this. And you're like, what? That makes no sense because of your diagnosis and what we've been working on and what you endured in your childhood. Like, you're going through all of these things, but of course we cannot make decisions for our clients. And so that's where we have to support their decision. The other thing I want to bring up is this also is a lot with our elderly senior population, right? If they have capacity, mental capacity, and the question will let you know whether or not they have it or not. Even if you see something that says the client has capacity, you already know, then you have to do whatever they say, whatever they want. And it's typically in the hospital setting, right? They want to go home. I have one right now, my aunt. She has capacity. So I feel like she does too much and she need to lay down somewhere. But she is determined. Okay, she's determined that she wants to live on her own and she wants to be able to take care of herself. So as long as she has that capacity, she can make that decision. The doctors can't make that decision unless it is going to put the person at a disadvantage. And then we can kind of talk about it and leverage it in terms of the social worker's role. But in terms of that client, they still can, we see it on Grey's Anatomy all the time. The doctor's like, hey, this is what you should do and to have a quality of life, to live longer. And they can decide, no, I don't want the surgery, or no, I don't want the treatment. They have that right to do that. So it's our job to really be an advocate for our client and what they want. And in the hospital setting, it is a little bit of a dance because you do have to be a little bit of a mediator of what the doctor is recommending versus what they want. You're going to support what they want. But if it goes against like medical advice, then you might have to do a little pros and cons and try to have a little more discussion. But if it's clear that they want one thing and it's not really going to it's not going to be a safety issue, then you're going to just do what they want. And you're going to say, doctor, that's not what they want. That's what you're going to say. Informed consent. So informed consent is a little bit different than a consent form. Sometimes we think about a consent form that we sign in order to get certain information from a provider. That is certainly something that is important in terms of confidentiality. but it's not necessarily what this is talking about. Informed consent is really a comprehensive description of what services you are providing. We need to allow our clients to make their own decision on whether or not they would like to continue with our services. And in order to do that, we need to let them know the purpose, the risks, the limits. If they have some type of HMO or third party where they can only get a certain amount of sessions, we need to let them know that up front. Right to refuse and withdraw consent, time frame covered by consent. Anytime you see on the exam the client's right to, pay attention to it, because in terms of the code of ethics, a client's right is really important. We know if a client lacks mental capacity, then they may have a third party, their power of attorney, or whoever they have put in charge of their medical care or their mental health care. But even if they have a third party, you're still going to ensure that the client is understanding as best as you can. Involuntary clients should also be given the nature of the services, and they still have a right to refuse the service. There's really no such thing as mandatory. It can be involuntary. They didn't choose to be there, right? But they honestly don't have to show up. And in that instance, you would explain their rights and the consequences, right? If you stop showing up, I'm going to have to write the judge that you're not showing up, right? And then use of technology. You want to make sure that the way that you use technology is compatible with your client's intellectual, emotional, and physical ability. For example, in terms of emotionally, let's say I'm really paranoid as the client, and I believe that my computer is bugged from the federal government. You may not be able to communicate with me over email, right? You may have to think about how I use technology. Obviously, we know with COVID, we have a lot of telework. To my knowledge, telework is not on the exam. However, it may be moving forward. So, but to my knowledge right now, the exam does not have things about telework, but it does have information about electronics and how we use electronics. We have to make sure things are encrypted when we send things, those types of things. Okay, competence. This is really big. We should not be providing services outside of our scope, outside of our education, our experience, our training. If we find ourselves, especially if we're a new social worker, obviously we're not going to have a whole lot of experience. And so that's where supervision is really important. So you see supervised experience. So even if you don't have experience with that type of population or problem, you're being supervised. And so in that, it makes you, they're getting competent services because of that. When you do not have the competence in the area, you need to seek consultation. A consultant can typically be someone who is outside of the agency. So we're going to have to get that consent form, right? That says, hey, I would like to consult with someone about your case. Even in doing that, we have to allow our clients to know that they can say no. Just because I feel like this would help me deal with whatever the issue is, it doesn't mean they have to say yes. And then you may have to take some other steps. In that instance. Okay, we talked about diversity in our human behavior and diversity course. So you always want to have a good working knowledge of your client's culture. It's really our responsibility, right? We're talking about our ethical responsibility. And so it's important that you are aware of different cultures. Not only that, but that you're aware of your own biases and how they impact your therapeutic relationship and treating a client who is of a different culture. And we know that in best practice, asking the client about their own identities, how they identify, and how what their culture means to them is the best thing, because we know that just because they are of a certain race or ethnic group doesn't mean they have all the same behaviors that are stereotypical. Conflicts of interest. This is fun. Has anyone experienced a conflict of interest lately? Or know of a coworker or of a situation that was a conflict of interest? Just think about it for a few seconds. There's so many different ways that we can have a conflict of interest. As a social worker, all of my friends are clinicians. They're good ones too. I'm like, oh man, my husband and I could really use some couples counseling, but I can't go to the people I know. I can't. It's a conflict of interest. Even some therapists, even though social work is kind of small, I know a therapist where one of the practices is, even though we may know of each other or have similar circles, right? I am not going to be your friend on social media, to keep that boundary. Because again, it is so hard with our profession. We know a lot of professionals. So when we need help ourselves, it could be a conflict of interest, right? Also, I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, and we call it Smalltimore because everybody is like related to each other. Like you would think that because it's a bigger city, it's a metro city, but it's so interesting how many people are related to each other. And so you just want to keep that in mind. In general, if I have a working knowledge of someone, like you really just have to be honest about how deep the relationship is, right? So if I'm like, oh, that's such and such friend, wife, cousin, like, okay, I know of them, right? So you kind of have to determine, is that a relationship that you have with them? And will that impact your treatment of them? Example, if I am having therapy, if I have a client as an individual, and then I say, well, I'm going to be your individual counselor and your couples counselor, even though it's been done a lot, that could cause a conflict of interest, especially if I started out with you individually and now I'm also your couples counselor. It could be a conflict of interest, right? Because I really have, it's when you say B, it's like you have an unfair advantage. You had more information on one individual because of your relationship with them. So it's like you had multiple roles, right? In terms of treatment. It could be that. It could be that you know them, right? And you just want to avoid that at all costs. Again, if you went to prom with them, that should not be your client. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just talking about the code of ethics. Whether or not you do that or whether or not people do that, that's different. Okay. Why do you think it says culturally sensitive boundaries set? If avoidable, clear, appropriate, culturally sensitive boundaries. Because sometimes you're in situations where some of that relational is actually valued. Like I know in like our culture, you know, we value different things, but but that relationship may be why they came to you, or maybe why they want to receive their treatment, right? And so sometimes there may be situations where it is culturally sensitive, especially if you had a smaller culture. You know, there may be, you just want to avoid it at all costs. But I think it's interesting that they say culturally sensitive boundaries, because there are different cultures where it may be a little harder. Even when you talk about accepting gifts, right? If that's their culture to give gifts, right? What does that mean? Right? And so what does the code of ethics say about accepting gifts? Everybody has different thoughts about it. But what I would say in general is to avoid accepting gifts. You can accept a gift for the agency. Like, let's say you're having a toy drive and they're like, oh my goodness, I really want to get you something for Christmas. You could say, hey, the agency is having a toy drive. Donate to the toy drive, and that's all I want, you know, or, well, not that you are saying they have to do it, but, you know, do that. That's something communal, right? But you don't want to start getting in the habit of accepting gifts specifically for you. Because what ends up happening is it taints the relationship. And then when you start to make professional decisions about their treatment, you know, then they're like, well, hey, wait a minute, I gave you a puppy last week. Like, what you mean? You know, you gonna make me pay everything I owe, right? It just makes it a little messier. Oh, and D is what I was talking about. Clarify professional obligation when working with two or more people that have a relationship with each other, right? Couples counseling, family counseling. And then avoid communication with clients using technology. So social media, you know, don't accept a friend request. I think we've all accepted a friend request or two. And text message, you really should not be using that for non-work related stuff. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. It's 8:11 on the Eastern side over here, so we will take a break. So again, conflicts of interest can happen knowingly or unknowingly. So a boundary violation is when it occurs knowingly, like engaging in dual relationships with knowledge of it, right? This could include sexual relationships, borrowing money from clients, or bartering services when it is not necessary. Boundary crossings. This occurs by accident. And there are different kinds of ways that you can address a boundary crossing. It may not mean that you have to immediately transfer the client. It may mean that you just need to tighten up your boundaries. So for example, if I know my client goes to the same church that I do, does that mean I have to discontinue the treatment relationship with them, especially if we've already had one and now they go to my church, right? What's the boundary we're going to put in place? You would have to talk to your client about it first. That's typically your first line of defense, is to have a discussion with your client about it. With children, you and their parents may cross, right? You might be in the same sports group. They may be at the same school, right? How do you handle those different situations? Having a discussion with your supervisor could also be a good line of defense, but you just want to clarify and firm up those boundaries. It doesn't always mean that therapist has to stop going to the book club, or, you know, I have to resign from everything. I can't do anything, right? It just may mean some boundaries may need to be put in place. Depending on how big the church is, you may not ever have to see them. Because if you go to one, you go to 8 o'clock and I go to 11 o'clock, how often are we really even seeing each other, right? But it could be very different if I have a higher level of involvement and exposure or contact with them, then we might just have to talk a little bit further about that. I have definitely, like we all have, seen a client in public and I just don't speak. That's my boundary. I don't speak unless I lock eyes, and then I'm like, hi, but you don't really want to speak because you don't know if they want people to know, because if you speak, then whoever they're with, it's like, well, who was that? So that might be a little awkward, especially if you're in child abuse and neglect and you were their worker. So I definitely had a situation where I saw my client and I was so excited because when I had the case, she was smaller, she was a baby. And then now she's like 4 or 5. And I definitely want to go up to the mother and see my baby because, that's a different ethical issue and so I just saw from afar. Maybe if she saw me and she spoke, then I would have, of course, spoke back. But I was like, oh, I wonder how they're doing. So making sure to ensure your boundaries. Privacy and confidentiality, also something that's definitely going to be on the exam. Dual relationships, going to be on the exam, either level. Confidentiality, going to be on the exam, right? It is a staple in social work, right? That we make sure that we maintain our clients' private information. When we have a family, couple, or group, whatever kind of the agreements that we come up with, we're going to try to stick to that as much as possible. Obviously, when you get to a group, if you have a group of 8, then confidentiality may be breached at times. And so it just means that you have to continually let them know what the rules about confidentiality are for that group and address it when it's being breached. Also, electronic exchange, you're going to see that sprinkled in because that's kind of where we are. And then I talked about the encryption and firewalls, making sure that if we are exchanging information over electronically, that we make sure that it's safe. Back in the day when we used fax machines, we would ensure that we go and get the fax off of the machine, right? Because if someone has faxed us some confidential information about our client and we leave it on the fax machine, obviously that could be dangerous, could get into the wrong hands, especially because we deal with social security numbers and all types of private information. Also, what has really been gearing up as well is our security training and security awareness, making sure that we know what the proper protocols to secure our clients' data. As we know, there is a lot of hacking and things like that happens all the time. So we want to make sure that we're being extra careful of that. The other place where privacy comes up is going to be in court, in legal matters. As a social worker, we can find ourselves, depending on our role, really any role is subject to being called into court. Okay. Some things I want you to keep in mind, no matter if you're at an agency or if you're in private practice, like you work for yourself, you are protected by some type of legal representation. Right? Even if you're in private practice, that's why you pay for malpractice insurance, so that you have bought a lawyer, like basically, right? That lawyer is going to work on your behalf. If it's an agency, most agencies and most organizations have lawyers on staff. So before we talk about subpoenas and court orders, what I want you to know in general, again, we can't go to every specific agency policy, right, about this, but in general, this is a legal matter, and addressing or making sure that I'm consulting my legal team is going to be a great first step. Sometimes the first step is to talk to your legal team. That may or may not be an option, right? So if that's not an option, then it also may say to talk to your supervisor about it, especially if you don't know what you're doing. If you don't know if you've never gotten a subpoena before, then you may need some assistance on what the next step should be. A subpoena is not a court order. A subpoena is a request for information. It can come from an attorney or it can come from the court as well. The court can subpoena you as well. But it is not a court order. So to a subpoena, we're going to provide a response. And 9 times out of 10, your response is no. No, I'm not going to turn over the records. No, I'm not going to testify to everything that's in my client's record. That's going to be our first way to keep our client's information private. Privileged communication. We're not at the level where we never, ever, ever have to say anything, right? Like it's not an attorney client privilege kind of thing, but it is similar. It's not that strict where we can tell our attorney that we murdered someone and then they can't say anything. It's not that strict, but we do have a form of it, and it's called privileged communication. It's a legal right, and it protects our clients from having all of the things that they talked about in court without their permission. It's even a way to write your notes up to kind of keep some of those things private. In the instance that legal ramifications might be, with that. Like, that your client is going through a divorce, and you're, writing your notes, you might have to, protect some of their private information if it has nothing to do with their treatment. A court order, however, is you have to follow that. Now, what we can do, and again, we're not typically going to be giving any requests or filing any motions or anything. We're going to have our legal team do that, but a court order must be followed. We should not go to jail, over this. The Code of Ethics is not saying go to jail, take it to the grave. It's not saying that. But what it is saying is to advocate for the client in the client's best interest. Hey, can you not ask me for this information? Right? If they say, there's a court order to give the entire client record, you can ask that the court withdraw that order. Like, no. Or you can ask if the order can be limited, meaning instead of giving all of the records, can I just give maybe a summary of what we talk about? Can I not disclose the disorder? Those types of things. Because even in our daily work, if people are calling us up, we can't even confirm that we have a client, right? In everyday life, right? That's how private it is. But when the courts get involved, it is something that we do have to follow, but we're going to advocate. If the court says no to both of those things and gives you a subsequent court order that asks for the entire record, you are going to give it to them. And you're going to also ask, hey, can this be sealed and not available for public inspection? Sometimes court proceedings are public knowledge. So you want to say, okay, but this cannot be. Or can I redact some of the personal information where you get the notes, but maybe I, redact some of the private information. But subsequently, the court order must be followed. We are almost at the end. We just have a few more concepts. Again, we're going over a little quick just because there is a lot, but it's not a lot you need to know about each of the things. So I'm trying to show you that you don't have to memorize or, have a solid working knowledge of everything, just the gist of the things. Access to records. We should not be denying records to our clients unless we feel like it could cause serious harm, and we should definitely document that. And we still have to give them access to limited portions. Well, why would a record cause serious harm? Because seeing your behaviors on paper and seeing the diagnosis can be very harmful, right? It could make the mental or emotional behaviors that they already have worse. So really is up to the professional, but it should be documented, and we should not just be denying records flat out. We know we should not engage in any sexual activities. Payment for services. We do not have to be broke social workers, okay? We can keep our clients accountable for payment. And a lot of Section 1, honestly, and really all of the code, but especially Section 1, a lot of it was written for private practice, right? So you have a sliding scale. That's good. That means your prices are fair and reasonable to their income. So that's what they say when setting fees. It should be fair and reasonable. And you should give clients a consideration of their ability to pay. No bartering. There are times where you can barter, but it's very, very specific. It's like, it has to be a rural setting. It has to be initiated by the client. You can't be exploiting the client. Like, I'll give you one therapy session if you give me 5 puppies and each puppy is worth $2,000. Right? That's not fair, right? So it has to be fair and reasonable. It has to be initiated by the client, meaning that they bring it up. And it has to be something that's a typical practice. So all of that, or most of that, should be in the scenario before you select that you're going to barter something. And bartering just means that I give you therapy, you give me a good or a service. Maybe you give me milk for a year, I don't know, from your cow that you hit from your farm or something. Right? Real rural. All the rest of us want money. We don't want your goods and services. And it's not a good practice. Interruption of services. We have to ensure that we are not disrupting the continuity of care for our clients. If we are not available, we cannot abandon our clients. That's what this basically means. We should not be abandoning our clients. If we have to go out on some type of leave, if we have vacation, we should be informing our clients ahead of time and planning accordingly. That leads us to referral. If we're not able to provide the services, then we should refer out. Even if we provide some services, but they need other types of services, then we should refer. So meaning, if I'm a case manager and I'm helping you with housing, but you really need help also with your mental health needs or medications and things that you need help with, then I should refer out for that. Termination of services. We can terminate our our services with our clients, and we should want to terminate services. But this was really talking about involuntarily terminating, right? We know we should terminate when we have progress of our goals. So that's kind of the first one, right? When our services are no longer required. We should not abandon clients that still need services. So again, if something happens and we're not able to continue the services, we need to refer them. We should not abandon them. And termination may occur. Here we go with our clients that want to give us cow's milk instead of money. And we're like, Termination may occur when fee-for-service clients are not paying an overdue balance, if financial arrangements have been made clear to the client. So you have to have all of these together, right? You have to have some type of arrangement. That means that they're overdue, but you gave them a chance to catch up. You also have to make sure they know that they owe the money, right? They might be like, oh, thank you so much. I don't owe anything. This is great, right? No, you owe me, but maybe you give me it in payments, right? This is definitely speaking to more private practice. You cannot terminate services with a client who is unsafe. If you have a client who is unsafe, you cannot terminate services with them. You're going to hold on to the client either until they're safe, or you're going to hold on to them until you can find them somewhere else to go for free, right? It doesn't mean that you're just gonna be pro bono, even though the code of ethics does say we should do some things pro bono. But it doesn't mean that we have to be pro bono in that instance. It may just mean that we have to keep the client for another month or so until we find them somewhere that they can go. Or they might need some insurance, might need to apply, it's different things. But if they're unsafe, you cannot terminate with them, because we don't want our clients to be having harm to themselves or others. Okay, so that was all of section 1 that was important. You should still read the entire section 1 and of course the entire code of ethics. These other sections I'm going to hit very briefly. Confidentiality, sexual relationships. I do want you to know that you can have a sexual relationship with your colleague and coworkers. They do not want you to do that with your supervisor, however, or your professor, right? Because it's a power differential. So you shouldn't engage in that, even though we probably do that too. But you can be a supervisor and they not be a supervisor, but you just can't be their supervisor, right? You don't want to have that type of authority over them. Unethical conduct of colleagues. For those who are religious, it kind of follows similar to the Bible, right? You want to go directly to the person. If that doesn't work, you want to go to their supervisor, and you might kind of follow the chain of command. If all of the agency is dirty, then you're going to report it to the board. That's kind of the final last resort. If it says that you already discussed it directly, then you're going to move to the next step, which is their supervisor. And again, on up the chain, you might say, okay, the supervisor corrupt too. Let me go to the director and see. If that doesn't work, I'm quitting and I'm going to report you. And then section 3 just has a few things just to keep in mind as well. When to use supervision. This is our last slide. When to use supervision. If you are a new social worker, you need supervision. not only when to use supervision, but this is really about when to select supervision as an answer. A lot of times it will say discuss with your supervisor. If you're a new social worker, if you're a student, that includes students. So if it specifically says you're a new graduate, you're a new social worker, you are a student intern, you already know. Any action they do needs to be to go to supervision first, because they really aren't able to act and behave as independently. Even in a safety situation, if their client tells them that they have some type of ideation, suicidal or homicidal, and that social worker does not know what to do, and it will say does not know how to proceed, does not know what the next action should be, then they need to go see their supervisor, like in session. Hold on one second, let me go get my supervisor. For counter transference and transference issues, we talked about that. When you are considering an ethical dilemma after you go to the code of ethics, then you want to kind of run it by your supervisor. And then any assistance with decisions concerning the client. If it says that you're overwhelmed, countertransference supervision, right? If it says that you're having difficulty with managing your clients, that's also a supervision issue, right? So any type of difficulties that the social worker may be experiencing, you want to do that through supervision. All right, we just did an overview of ethics.